Her flushed face, fringed with soft curling hair under her nightcap, was radiant with joy and courage. Though there was so little that was complex or artificial in Kitty's character in general, Levin was struck by what was revealed now, when suddenly all disguises were thrown off and the very kernel of her soul shone in her eyes. And in this simplicity and nakedness of her soul, she, the very woman he loved in her, was more manifest than ever. She looked at him, smiling, but all at once her brows twitched. She threw up her head, and going quickly up to him, clutched his hand and pressed close up to him, breathing her hot breath upon him. She was in pain, and was, as it were, complaining to him of her suffering. And for the first minute, from habit, it seemed to him that he was to blame. But in her eyes there was a tenderness that told him that she was far from reproaching him, that she loved him for her sufferings. If not I, who is to blame for it, he thought unconsciously, seeking someone responsible for this suffering for him to punish. But there was no one responsible. She was suffering, complaining and triumphing in her sufferings, and rejoicing in them and loving them. He saw that something sublime was being accomplished in her soul, but what? He could not make it out. It was beyond his understanding. "I have sent to Mamma. You go quickly to fetch Lizaveta Petrovna." "Kostya!" "Nothing. It's over." She moved away from him and rang the bell. "Well, go now. Pasha's coming. I am all right." And Levin saw with astonishment that she had taken up the knitting she had brought in the night and begun working at it again. As Levin was going out of one door, he heard the maidservant come in at the other. He stood at the door and heard Kitty giving exact directions to the maid and beginning to help her move the bedstead. He dressed, and while they were putting in his horses, as a hired sledge was not to be seen yet, he ran again up to the bedroom, not on tiptoe it seemed to him, but on wings. 2 maidservants were carefully moving something in the bedroom. Kitty was walking about, knitting rapidly and giving directions. "I'm going for the doctor. They have sent for Lizaveta Petrovna, but I'll go on there too. Isn't there anything wanted?" "Yes. Shall I go to Dolly's?" She looked at him, obviously not hearing what he was saying. "Yes, yes, do go," she said quickly, frowning and waving her hand to him. He had just gone into the drawing-room when suddenly a plaintive moan sounded from the bedroom, smothered instantly. He stood still, and for a long while he could not understand. "Yes, that is she," he said to himself, and clutching at his head he ran downstairs. "Lord, have mercy on us, pardon us, aid us," he repeated the words that for some reason came suddenly to his lips. And he, an unbeliever, repeated those words not with his lips only. At that instant he knew that all his doubts, even the impossibility of believing with his reason, of which he was aware in himself, did not in the least hinder his turning to God. All of that now floated out of his soul like dust. To whom was he to turn if not to him in whose hands he felt himself, his soul and his love? The horse was not yet ready, but feeling a peculiar concentration of his physical forces and his intellect on what he had to do, he started off on foot without waiting for the horse and told Kuzma to overtake him. At the corner he met a night cabman driving hurriedly. In the little sledge, wrapped in a velvet cloak, sat Lizaveta Petrovna with a kerchief round her head. Thank God, he said, overjoyed to recognize her little fair face, which wore a peculiarly serious, even stern expression. Telling the driver not to stop, he ran along beside her. "For 2 hours, then, not more?" she inquired. "You should let Pyotr Dmitrievitch know, but don't hurry him, and get some opium at the chemist's." "So you think that it may go on well?" "Lord, have mercy on us and help us," Levin said, seeing his own horse driving out of the gate. Jumping into the sledge beside Kuzma, he told him to drive to the doctor's. Chapter 14. The doctor was not yet up, and the footman said that he had been up late and had given orders not to be waked but would get up soon. The footman was cleaning the lamp chimneys and seemed very busy about them. This concentration of the footman upon his lamps and his indifference to what was passing in Levin at first astounded him, but immediately on considering the question he realized that no one knew or was bound to know his feelings, and that it was all the more necessary to act calmly, sensibly, and resolutely to get through this wall of indifference and attain his aim. "Don't be in a hurry, or let anything slip," Levin said to himself, feeling a greater and greater flow of physical energy and attention to all that lay before him to do. Having ascertained that the doctor was not getting up, Levin considered various plans and decided on the following one: that Kuzma should go for another doctor, while he himself should go to the chemist's for opium, and if, when he came back, the doctor had not yet begun to get up, he would either, by tipping the footman, or by force, wake the doctor at all hazards. At the chemist's, the lank shopman sealed up a packet of powders for a coachman who stood waiting, and refused him opium with the same callousness with which the doctor's footman had cleaned his lamp chimneys. Trying not to get flurried or out of temper, Levin mentioned the names of the doctor and midwife, and explaining what the opium was needed for, tried to persuade him. The assistant inquired in German whether he should give it, and receiving an affirmative reply from behind the partition, he took out a bottle and a funnel, deliberately poured the opium from a bigger bottle into a little one, stuck on a label, sealed it up, in spite of Levin's request that he would not do so, and was about to wrap it up too. This was more than Levin could stand. He took the bottle firmly out of his hands and ran to the big glass doors. The doctor was not even now getting up, and the footman, busy now in putting down the rugs, refused to wake him. Levin deliberately took out a 10-ruble note, and careful to speak slowly, though losing no time over the business, he handed him the note and explained that Pyotr Dmitrievich— what a great and important personage he seemed to Levin now, this Pyotr Dmitrievich, who had been of so little consequence in his eyes before— had promised to come at any time, that he would certainly not be angry, and that he must therefore wake him at once. The footman agreed and went upstairs, taking Levin into the waiting room. Levin could hear through the door the doctor coughing, moving about, washing and saying something. 3 minutes passed. It seemed to Levin that more than an hour had gone by. He could not wait any longer. "Pyotr Dmitrievich, Pyotr Dmitrievich," he said, in an imploring voice at the open door. "For God's sake, forgive me. See me as you are. It's been going on more than 2 hours already." In a minute," answered a voice, and to his amazement Levin heard that the doctor was smiling as he spoke. "For 1 instant." "In a minute." 2 minutes more passed while the doctor was putting on his boots, and 2 minutes more while the doctor put on his coat and combed his hair. "Pyotr Dmitrievich," Levin was beginning again in a plaintive voice, just as the doctor came in dressed and ready. "These people have no conscience," thought Levin, "combing his hair while we're dying." "Good morning," the doctor said to him, shaking hands, and as it was, teasing him with his composure. "There's no hurry. Well now." Trying to be as accurate as possible, Levin began to tell him every unnecessary detail of his wife's condition, interrupting his account repeatedly with entreaties that the doctor would come with him at once. "Oh, you needn't be in any hurry. You don't understand, you know. I'm certain I'm not wanted. Still, I've promised, and if you like I'll come. But there's no hurry. Please sit down. Won't you have some coffee?" Levin stared at him with eyes that asked whether he was laughing at him, but the doctor had no notion of making fun of him. I know," the doctor said, smiling. "I'm a married man myself, and at these moments we husbands are very much to be pitied. I've a patient whose husband always takes refuge in the stables on such occasions. But what do you think, Pyotr Dmitrievitch? Do you suppose it may go all right?" "Everything points to a favorable issue." "So you'll come immediately," said Levin, looking wrathfully at the servant who was bringing in the coffee. "In an hour's time." "Oh, for mercy's sake!" "Well, let me drink my coffee, anyway." The doctor started upon his coffee. Both were silent. "The Turks are getting really beaten, though. Did you read yesterday's telegrams?" said the doctor, munching some roll. "No, I can't stand it," said Levin, jumping up. "So you'll be with us in a quarter of an hour?" "In half an hour." "On your honor?" When Levin got home, he drove up at the same time as the princess, and they went up to the bedroom door together. The princess had tears in her eyes, and her hands were shaking. Seeing Levin, she embraced him and burst into tears. "Well, my dear Lizaveta Petrovna?" she queried, clasping the hand of the midwife, who came out to meet them with a beaming and anxious face. "She's going on well," she said. "Persuade her to lie down. She will be easier so." From the moment when he had waked up and understood what was going on, Levin had prepared his mind to bear resolutely what was before him, and without considering or anticipating anything, to avoid upsetting his wife, and on the contrary, to soothe her and keep up her courage. Without allowing himself even to think of what was to come, of how it would end, judging from his inquiries as to the usual duration of these ordeals, Levin had in his imagination braced himself to bear up and to keep a tight rein on his feelings for 5 hours, and it had seemed to him he could do this. But when he came back from the doctor's and saw her sufferings again, he fell to repeating more and more frequently, "Lord, have mercy on us and succor us." He sighed and flung his head up and began to feel afraid he could not bear it, that he would burst into tears or run away. Such agony it was to him, and only 1 hour had passed. But after that hour there passed another hour, 2 hours, 3, and the full 5 hours he had fixed as the furthest limit of his sufferings, and the position was still unchanged, and he was still bearing it because there was nothing to be done but bear it, every instant feeling that he had reached the utmost limits of his endurance, and that his heart would break with sympathy and pain. But still the minutes passed by, and the hours, and still hours more, and his misery and horror grew and were more and more intense. All the ordinary conditions of life, without which one can form no conception of anything, had ceased to exist for Levin. He lost all sense of time. Minutes, those minutes when she sent for him and he held her moist hand that would squeeze his hand with extraordinary violence and then push it away, seemed to him hours, and hours seemed to him minutes. He was surprised when Lizaveta Petrovna asked him to light a candle behind a screen, and he found that it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. If he had been told it was only 10 o'clock in the morning, he would not have been more surprised. Where he was all this time, he knew as little as the time of anything. He saw her swollen face, sometimes bewildered and in agony, sometimes smiling and trying to reassure him. He saw the old princess, too, flushed and overwrought, with her grey curls in disorder, forcing herself to gulp down her tears, biting her lips. He saw Dolly, too, and the doctor, smoking fat cigarettes, and Lizaveta Petrovna, with a firm, resolute, reassuring face, and the old prince walking up and down the hall with a frowning face. But why they came in and went out, where they were, he did not know. The princess was with the doctor in the bedroom, then in the study, where a table set for dinner suddenly appeared. Then she was not there, but Dolly was. Then Levin remembered he had been sent somewhere. Once he had been sent to move a table and sofa. He had done this eagerly, thinking it had to be done for her sake, and only later on he found it was his own bed he had been getting ready. Then he had been sent to the study to ask the doctor something. The doctor had answered, and then had said something about the irregularities in the municipal council. Then he had been sent to the bedroom to help the old princess to move the holy picture in its silver and gold setting, and with the princess's old waiting-maid he had clambered on a shelf to reach it, and had broken the little lamp. And the old servant had tried to reassure him about the lamp, and about his wife, and he carried the holy picture and set it at Kitty's head, carefully tucking it in behind the pillow. But where, when, and why all this had happened he could not tell. He did not understand why the old princess took his hand, and looking compassionately at him, begged him not to worry himself, and Dolly persuaded him to eat something and led him out of the room, and even the doctor looked seriously and with commiseration at him and offered him a drop of something. All he knew and felt was that what was happening was what had happened nearly a year before in the hotel of the country town at the deathbed of his brother Nikolai. But that had been grief, this was joy. Yet that grief and this joy were alike outside all the ordinary conditions of life. They were loopholes, as it were, in that ordinary life, through which there came glimpses of something sublime. And in the contemplation of this sublime something the soul was exalted to inconceivable heights of which it had before had no conception, while reason lagged behind, unable to keep up with it. "Lord, have mercy on us, and succor us," he repeated to himself incessantly, feeling, in spite of his long and, as it seemed, complete alienation from religion, that he turned to God just as trustfully and simply as he had in his childhood and first youth. All this time he had two distinct spiritual conditions. One was away from her, with the doctor, who kept smoking one fat cigarette after another and extinguishing them on the edge of the full ashtray, with Dolly, and with the old prince, where there was talk about dinner, about politics, about Maria Petrovna's illness, and where Levin suddenly forgot for a minute what was happening, and felt as though he had waked up from sleep. The other was in her presence, at her pillow, where his heart seemed breaking and still did not break from sympathetic suffering, and he prayed to God without ceasing. And every time he was brought back from a moment of oblivion by a scream reaching him from the bedroom, he fell into the same strange terror that had come upon him the first minute. Every time he heard a shriek, he jumped up, ran to justify himself, remembered on the way that he was not to blame, and he longed to defend her, to help her. But as he looked at her, he saw again that help was impossible, and he was filled with terror and prayed, "Lord, have mercy on us and help us." And as time went on, both these conditions became more intense. The calmer he became away from her, completely forgetting her, the more agonizing became both her sufferings and his feeling of helplessness before them. He jumped up, would have liked to run away, but he ran to her. Sometimes, when again and again she called upon him, he blamed her. But seeing her patient, smiling face and hearing the words, "I am worrying you," he threw the blame on God. But thinking of God, at once he fell to beseeching God to forgive him and have mercy. Chapter 15. He did not know whether it was late or early. The candles had all burned out. Dolly had just been in the study and had suggested to the doctor that he should lie down. Levin sat listening to the doctor's stories of a quack mesmerizer and looking at the ashes of his cigarette. There had been a period of repose, and he had sunk into oblivion. He had completely forgotten what was going on now. He heard the doctor's chat and understood it. Suddenly there came an unearthly shriek. The shriek was so awful that Levin did not even jump up, but holding his breath, gazed in terrified inquiry at the doctor. The doctor put his head on one side, listened, and smiled approvingly. Everything was so extraordinary that nothing could strike Levin as strange. I suppose it must be so, he thought, and still sat where he was. Whose scream was this? He jumped up, ran on tiptoe to the bedroom, edged round Lizaveta Petrovna and the princess, and took up his position at Kitty's pillow. The scream had subsided, but there was some change now. What it was he did not see and did not comprehend, and he had no wish to see or comprehend, but he saw it by the face of Lizaveta Petrovna. Lizaveta Petrovna's face was stern and pale, and still as resolute, though her jaws were twitching and her eyes were fixed intently on Kitty. Kitty's swollen and agonized face, a tress of hair clinging to her moist brow, was turned to him and sought his eyes. Her lifted hands asked for his hands. Clutching his chill hands in her moist ones, she began squeezing them to her face. "Don't go, don't go. I'm not afraid, she said rapidly. "Mamma, take my earrings. They bother me. You're not afraid? Quick, quick, Lizaveta Petrovna." She spoke quickly, very quickly, and tried to smile, but suddenly her face was drawn. She pushed him away. "Oh, this is awful! I'm dying! Go away!" she shrieked, and again he heard that unearthly scream. Levin clutched at his head and ran out of the room. It's nothing, it's all right," Dolly called after him. But they might say what they liked. He knew now that all was over. He stood in the next room, his head leaning against the doorpost, and heard shrieks, howls such as he had never heard before, and he knew that what had been Kitty was uttering these shrieks. He had long ago ceased to wish for the child. By now he loathed this child. He did not even wish for her life now. All he longed for was the end of this awful anguish. "Doctor, what is it? What is it? By God," he said, snatching at the doctor's hand as he came up. "It's the end," said the doctor, and the doctor's face was so grave as he said it that Levin took the end as meaning her death. Beside himself, he ran into the bedroom. The first thing he saw was the face of Lizaveta Petrovna. It was even more frowning and stern. Kitty's face he did not know. In the place where it had been was something that was fearful in its strained distortion and in the sounds that came from it. He fell down with his head on the wooden framework of the bed, feeling that his heart was bursting. The awful scream never paused. It became still more awful, and as though it had reached the utmost limit of terror, suddenly it ceased. Levin could not believe his ears, but there could be no doubt. The scream had ceased, and he heard a subdued stir and bustle and hurried breathing, and her voice, gasping, alive, tender and blissful, uttered softly, "It's over." He lifted his head. With her hands hanging exhausted on the quilt, looking extraordinarily lovely and serene, she looked at him in silence and tried to smile and could not. And suddenly, from the mysterious and awful faraway world in which he had been living for the last 22 hours, Levin felt himself, all in an instant, borne back to the old everyday world, glorified though now, by such a radiance of happiness that he could not bear it. The strained chords snapped. Sobs and tears of joy which he had never foreseen rose up with such violence that his whole body shook, that for long they prevented him from speaking. Falling on his knees before the bed, he held his wife's hand before his lips and kissed it, and the hand, with a weak movement of the fingers, responded to his kiss. And meanwhile, there, at the foot of the bed, in the deft hands of Lizaveta Petrovna, like a flickering light in a lamp, lay the life of a human creature which had never existed before, and which would now, with the same right, with the same importance to itself, live and create in its own image. "Alive! Alive! And a boy, too! Set your mind at rest," Levin heard Lizaveta Petrovna saying as she slapped the baby's back with a shaking hand. "Mamma, is it true?" said Kitty's voice. The princess's sobs were all the answers she could make, and in the midst of the silence there came, in unmistakable reply to the mother's question, a voice unlike the subdued voices speaking in the room. It was the bold, clamorous, self-assertive squall of the new human being who had so incomprehensibly appeared. If Levin had been told before that Kitty was dead, and that he had died with her, and that their children were angels, and that God was standing before him, he would have been surprised at nothing. But now, coming back into the world of reality, he had to make great mental efforts to take in that she was alive and well, and that the creature squalling so desperately was his son. Kitty was alive, her agony was over, and he was unutterably happy. That he understood. He was completely happy in it. But the baby? Whence? Why? Who was he? He could not get used to the idea. It seemed to him something extraneous, superfluous, to which he could not accustom himself. Chapter 16. At 10 o'clock, the old prince, Sergei Ivanovitch, and Stefan Arkadyevitch were sitting at Levin's. Having inquired after Kitty, they had dropped into conversation upon other subjects. Levin heard them, and unconsciously, as they talked, going over the past, over what had been up to that morning, he thought of himself as he had been yesterday till that point. It was as though 100 years had passed since then. He felt himself exalted to unattainable heights, from which he studiously lowered himself so as not to wound people he was talking to. He talked, and was all the time thinking of his wife, of her condition now, of his son, in whose existence he tried to school himself into believing. The whole world of woman, which had taken for him since his marriage a new value he had never suspected before, was now so exalted that he could not take it in his imagination. He heard them talk of yesterday's dinner at the club, and thought, "What is happening with her now? Is she asleep? How is she? What is she thinking of? Is he crying, my son, Dmitri?" And in the middle of the conversation, in the middle of a sentence, he jumped up and went out of the room. "Send me word if I can see her," said the prince. "Very well, in a minute," answered Levin, and without stopping he went to her room. She was not asleep. She was talking gently with her mother, making plans about the christening. Carefully set to rights, with hair well brushed, in a smart little cap with some blue in it, her arms out on the quilt, she was lying on her back. Meeting his eyes, her eyes drew him to her. Her face, bright before, brightened still more as he drew near her. There was the same change in it from earthly to unearthly that is seen in the face of the dead. But then it means farewell, here it meant welcome. Again, a rush of emotion, such as he had felt at the moment of the child's birth, flooded his heart. She took his hand and asked him if he had slept. He could not answer, and turned away, struggling with his weakness. "I have had a nap, Kostya," she said to him. "I am so comfortable now." She looked at him, but suddenly her expression changed. "Give him to me," she said, hearing the baby's cry. Give him to me, Lizaveta Petrovna, and he shall look at him. To be sure, his papa shall look at him, said Lizaveta Petrovna, getting up and bringing something red and queer and wriggling. Wait a minute, we'll make him tidy first. And Lizaveta Petrovna laid the red wobbling thing on the bed, began untrussing and trussing up the baby, lifting it up and turning it over with one finger and powdering it with something. Levin, looking at the tiny, pitiful creature, made strenuous efforts to discover in his heart some traces of fatherly feeling for it. He felt nothing towards it but disgust. But when it was undressed, and he caught a glimpse of wee little hands, little feet, saffron-coloured, with little toes too, and positively with a little big toe different from the rest, and when he saw Lizaveta Petrovna closing the wide-open little hands as though they were soft springs, and putting them into linen garments, such pity for the little creature came upon him, and such terror that she would hurt it, that he held her hand back. Lizaveta Petrovna laughed. Don't be frightened, don't be frightened. When the baby had been put to rights and transformed into a firm doll, Lizaveta Petrovna dandled it as though proud of her handiwork, and stood a little away so that Levin might see his son in all his glory. Kitty looked sideways in the same direction, never taking her eyes off the baby. Give him to me, she said, and even made as though she would sit up. What are you thinking of, Katerina Alexandrovna? You mustn't move like that. Wait a minute, I'll give him to you. Here we're showing Papa what a fine fellow we are. And Lizaveta Petrovna, with one hand supporting the wobbling head, lifted up on the other arm the strange, limp, red creature, whose head was lost in its swaddling clothes. But it had a nose, too, and slanting eyes and smacking lips. A splendid baby, said Lizaveta Petrovna. Levin sighed with mortification. This splendid baby excited in him no feeling but disgust and compassion. It was not at all the feeling he had looked forward to. He turned away while Lizaveta Petrovna put the baby to the unaccustomed breast. Suddenly, laughter made him look round. The baby had taken the breast. Come, that's enough, said Lizaveta Petrovna, but Kitty would not let the baby go. He fell asleep in her arms. Look now, said Kitty, turning the baby so that he could see it. The aged-looking little face suddenly puckered up still more, and the baby sneezed. Smiling, hardly able to restrain his tears, Levin kissed his wife and went out of the dark room. What he felt towards this little creature was utterly unlike what he had expected. There was nothing cheerful and joyous in the feeling. On the contrary, it was a new torture of apprehension. It was the consciousness of a new sphere of liability to pain. And this sense was so painful at first, the apprehension lest this helpless creature should suffer was so intense, that it prevented him from noticing the strange thrill of senseless joy and even pride that he had felt when the baby sneezed. Chapter 17. Stefan Arkadyevich's affairs were in a very bad way. The money for 2/3 of the forest had all been spent already, and he had borrowed from the merchant in advance at 10% discount almost all the remaining third. The merchant would not give more, especially as Darya Alexandrovna, for the first time that winter, insisting on her right to her own property, had refused to sign the receipt for the payment of the last third of the forest. All his salary went on household expenses and in payment of petty debts that could not be put off. There was positively no money. This was unpleasant and awkward, and in Stefan Arkadyevich's opinion things could not go on like this. The explanation of the position was, in his view, to be found in the fact that his salary was too small. The post he filled had been unmistakably very good 5 years ago, but it was so no longer. Petrov, the bank director, had 12,000. Sventitsky, a company director, had 17,000. Mitin, who had founded a bank, received 50,000. Clearly, I've been napping and they've overlooked me, Stepan Arkadyevitch thought about himself. And he began keeping his eyes and ears open, and towards the end of the winter he had discovered a very good berth and had formed a plan of attack upon it, at first from Moscow through aunts, uncles and friends, and then, when the matter was well advanced, in the spring, he went himself to Petersburg. It was one of those snug, lucrative berths of which there are so many more nowadays than there used to be, with incomes ranging from 1,000 to 50,000 rubles. It was the post of Secretary of the Committee of the Amalgamated Agency of the Southern Railways, and of certain banking companies. This position, like all such appointments, called for such immense energy and such varied qualifications that it was difficult for them to be found united in any one man. And since a man combining all the qualifications was not to be found, it was at least better that the post be filled by an honest than by a dishonest man. And Stepan Arkadyevitch was not merely an honest man. Unemphatically, in the common acceptation of the words, he was an honest man. Emphatically, in that special sense which the word has in Moscow when they talk of an honest politician, an honest writer, an honest newspaper, an honest institution, an honest tendency, meaning not simply that the man or the institution is not dishonest, but that they are capable on occasion of taking a line of their own in opposition to the authorities. Stepan Arkadyevitch moved in those circles in Moscow in which that expression had come into use, was regarded there as an honest man, and so had more right to this appointment than others. The appointment yielded an income of from 7,000 to 10,000 a year, and Oblonsky could fill it without giving up his government position. It was in the hands of 2 ministers, 1 lady and 2 Jews, and all these people, though the way had been paved already with them, Stepan Arkadyevitch had to see in Petersburg. Besides this business, Stepan Arkadyevitch had promised his sister Anna to obtain from Karenin a definite answer on the question of divorce, and begging 50 rubles from Dolly, he set off for Petersburg. Stepan Arkadyevitch sat in Karenin's study, listening to his report on the causes of the unsatisfactory position of Russian finance, and only waiting for the moment when he would finish to speak about his own business or about Anna. "Yes, that's very true," he said, when Alexey Alexandrovitch took off the pince-nez, without which he could not read now, and looked inquiringly at his former brother-in-law. "That's very true in particular cases, but still the principle of our day is freedom." "Yes, but I laid down another principle, embracing the principle of freedom," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, with emphasis on the word embracing, and he put on his pince-nez again so as to read the passage in which this statement was made. And turning over the beautifully written, wide-margined manuscript, Alexey Alexandrovitch read aloud over again the conclusive passage. "I don't advocate protection for the sake of private interests, but for the public weal, and for the lower and upper classes equally," he said, looking over his pince-nez at Oblonsky. "But they cannot grasp that. They are taken up with personal interests and carried away by phrases." Stepan Arkadyevitch knew that when Karenin began to talk of what they were doing and thinking, the persons who would not accept his report, and were the cause of everything wrong in Russia, that it was coming near the end. And so he eagerly abandoned the principle of free trade and fully agreed. Alexey Alexandrovitch paused, thoughtfully turning over the pages of his manuscript. "Oh, by the way," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, "I wanted to ask you, some time when you see Pomorsky, to drop him a hint that I should be very glad to get that new appointment as Secretary of the Committee of the Amalgamated Agency of the Southern Railways and Banking Companies. Stefan Arkadyevitch was familiar by now with the title of the post he coveted, and brought it out rapidly without mistake. Alexey Alexandrovitch questioned him as to the duties of this new committee, and pondered. He was considering whether the new committee would not be acting in some way contrary to the views he had been advocating. But as the influence of the new committee was of a very complex nature, and his views were of very wide application, he could not decide this straight off, and taking off his pince-nez, he said, "Of course, I can mention it to him, but what is your reason precisely for wishing to obtain the appointment?" "It's a good salary, rising to 9,000, and my means—" "9,000?" repeated Alexey Alexandrovitch, and he frowned. The high figure of the salary made him reflect that on that side Stefan Arkadyevitch's proposed position ran counter to the main tendency of his own projects of reform, which always leaned towards economy. "I consider, and I have embodied my views in a note on the subject, that in our day these immense salaries are evidence of the unsound economic assiette of our finances." "But what's to be done?" said Stefan Arkadyevitch. "Suppose a bank director gets 10,000. Well, he's worth it. Or an engineer gets 20,000. After all, it's a growing thing, you know." "I assume that a salary is the price paid for a commodity, and it ought to conform with the law of supply and demand. If the salary is fixed without any regard for that law, as, for instance, when I see two engineers leaving college together, both equally well trained and efficient, and one getting 40,000 while the other is satisfied with 2, or when I see lawyers and hussars, having no special qualifications, appointed directors of banking companies with immense salaries, I conclude that the salary is not fixed in accordance with the law of supply and demand, but simply through personal interest. And this is an abuse of great gravity in itself, and one that reacts injuriously on the government service. I consider—" Stefan Arkadyevitch made haste to interrupt his brother-in-law. "Yes, but you must agree that it's a new institution of undoubted utility that's being started. After all, you know, it's a growing thing. What they lay particular stress on is the thing being carried on honestly," said Stefan Arkadyevitch with emphasis. But the Moscow significance of the word honest was lost on Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Honesty is only a negative qualification," he said. "Well, you'll do me a great service anyway," said Stefan Arkadyevitch, "by putting in a word to Pomorsky, just in the way of conversation." "But I fancy it's more in Volgarinov's hands," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Volgarinov has fully assented, as far as he's concerned," said Stefan Arkadyevitch, turning red. Stefan Arkadyevitch reddened at the mention of that name, because he had been that morning at the Jew Volgarinov's, and the visit had left an unpleasant recollection. Stefan Arkadyevitch believed most positively that the committee in which he was trying to get an appointment was a new, genuine, and honest public body. But that morning, when Volgarinov had, intentionally, beyond a doubt, kept him 2 hours waiting with other petitioners in his waiting room, he had suddenly felt uneasy. Stefan Arkadyevitch believed most positively that the committee in which he was trying to get an appointment was a new, genuine, and honest public body. But that morning, when Volgarinov had, intentionally, beyond a doubt, kept him 2 hours waiting with other petitioners in his waiting room, he had suddenly felt uneasy. Whether he was uncomfortable that he, a descendant of Rurik, Prince Oblonsky, had been kept for 2 hours waiting to see a Jew, or that for the first time in his life he was not following the example of his ancestors in serving the government, but was turning off to a new career, anyway he was very uncomfortable. During those 2 hours in Volgarinov's waiting room, Stefan Arkadyevitch, stepping jauntily about the room, pulling his whiskers, entering into conversation with the other petitioners, and inventing an epigram on his position, assiduously concealed from others, and even from himself, the feeling he was experiencing. But all the time he was uncomfortable and angry. He could not have said why, whether because he could not get his epigram just right, or from some other reason. When at last Volgarinov had received him with exaggerated politeness and unmistakable triumph at his humiliation, and had all but refused the favor asked of him, Stefan Arkadyevitch had made haste to forget it all as soon as possible, and now at the mere recollection he blushed. Chapter 18. Now, there is something I want to talk about, and you know what it is. About Anna, Stefan Arkadyevitch said, pausing for a brief space and shaking off the unpleasant impression. As soon as Oblonsky uttered Anna's name, the face of Alexey Alexandrovitch was completely transformed. All the life was gone out of it, and it looked weary and dead. "What is it exactly that you want from me?" he said, moving in his chair and snapping his pince-nez. "A definite settlement, Alexey Alexandrovitch. Some settlement of the position. I'm appealing to you." "Not as an injured husband," Stefan Arkadyevitch was going to say, but afraid of wrecking his negotiation by this, he changed the words. "Not as a statesman," which did not sound apropos, "but simply as a man, and a good-hearted man, and a Christian. You must have pity on her," he said. "That is, in what way precisely?" Karenin said softly. "Yes, pity on her. If you had seen her as I have, I've been spending all the winter with her, you would have pity on her. Her position is awful, simply awful." "I had imagined," answered Alexey Alexandrovitch in a higher, almost shrill voice, "that Anna Arkadyevna had everything she had desired for herself." "Oh, Alexey Alexandrovitch, for heaven's sake, don't let us indulge in recriminations. What is past, and you know what she wants and is waiting for. Divorce." "But I believe Anna Arkadyevna refuses a divorce if I make it a condition to leave me my son. I replied in that sense, and supposed that the matter was ended. I consider it at an end," shrieked Alexey Alexandrovitch. "But for heaven's sake, don't get hot," said Stefan Arkadyevitch, touching his brother-in-law's knee. "The matter is not ended. If you will allow me to recapitulate, it was like this. When you parted, you were as magnanimous as could possibly be. You were ready to give her everything, freedom, divorce even. She appreciated that. No, don't think that. She did appreciate it, to such a degree that at the first moment, feeling how she had wronged you, she did not consider and could not consider everything. She gave up everything. But experience, time have shown that her position is unbearable, impossible." "The life of Anna Arkadyevna can have no interest for me," Alexey Alexandrovitch put in, lifting his eyebrows. "Allow me to disbelieve that," Stefan Arkadyevitch replied gently. "Her position is intolerable for her, and of no benefit to anyone whatever. She has deserved it, you'll say. She knows that, and asks you for nothing. She says plainly that she dare not ask you. But I, all of us, her relatives, all who love her, beg you, entreat you. Why should she suffer, who is any the better for it?" "Excuse me, you seem to put me in the position of the guilty party," observed Alexey Alexandrovitch. Oh, no, not at all. Please understand me," said Stefan Arkadyevitch, touching his hand again, as though feeling sure this physical contact would soften his brother-in-law. "All I say is this. Her position is intolerable, and it might be alleviated by you, and you will lose nothing by it. I will arrange it all for you so that you'll not notice it. You did promise it, you know." "The promise was given before, and I had supposed that the question of my son had settled the matter. Besides, I had hoped that Anna Arkadyevna had enough generosity," Alexey Alexandrovitch articulated with difficulty, his lips twitching and his face white. "She leaves it all to your generosity. She begs, she implores one thing of you, to extricate her from the impossible position in which she is placed. She does not ask for her son now. Alexey Alexandrovitch, you are a good man. Put yourself in her position for a minute. The question of divorce for her in her position is a question of life and death. If you had not promised it once, she would have reconciled herself to her position. She would have gone on living in the country. But you promised it, and she wrote to you and moved to Moscow. And here she's been for 6 months in Moscow, where every chance meeting cuts her to the heart, every day expecting an answer. Why, it's like keeping a condemned criminal for 6 months with a rope round his neck, promising him perhaps death, perhaps mercy. Have pity on her, and I will undertake to arrange everything. Vos scruples." "I am not talking about that, Alexey Alexandrovitch interrupted with disgust. "But perhaps I promised what I had no right to promise." "So you go back from your promise?" "I have never refused to do all that is possible, but I want time to consider how much of what I promised is possible." "No, Alexey Alexandrovitch," cried Oblonsky, jumping up. "I won't believe that. She's unhappy as only an unhappy woman can be, and you cannot refuse in such." "As much of what I promised as is possible. Vous professez d'être libre penseur. As a believer, I cannot, in a matter of such gravity, act in opposition to the Christian law." "But in Christian societies and among us, as far as I am aware, divorce is allowed," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "Divorce is sanctioned even by our church, and we see." "It is allowed, but not in the sense—" "Alexey Alexandrovitch, you are not like yourself," said Oblonsky after a brief pause. "Wasn't it you, and didn't we all appreciate it in you, who forgave everything and moved simply by Christian feeling, was ready to make any sacrifice? You said yourself, 'If a man take thy coat, give him thy cloak also.' And now—" "I beg," said Alexey Alexandrovitch shrilly, getting suddenly onto his feet, his face white and his jaws twitching. "I beg you to drop this subject." "Oh, no. Oh, forgive me. Forgive me if I have wounded you," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, holding out his hand with a smile of embarrassment. "But like a messenger, I have simply performed the commission given me." Alexey Alexandrovitch gave him his hand, pondered a little, and said, "I must think it over and seek for guidance. The day after tomorrow I will give you a final answer," he said, after considering a moment. Chapter 19. Stepan Arkadyevitch was about to go away when Kornei came in to announce, "Sergei Alexeyitch." "Who's Sergei Alexeyitch?" Stepan Arkadyevitch was beginning, but he remembered immediately. "Ah, Seryozha," he said aloud. "Sergei Alexeyitch. I thought it was the director of a department. Anna asked me to see him, too," he thought. And he recalled the timid, piteous expression with which Anna had said to him at parting, "Anyway, you will see him. Find out exactly where he is, who is looking after him. And Stiva, if it were possible, could it be possible?" Stepan Arkadyevitch knew what was meant by that, if it were possible. If it were possible to arrange the divorce so as to let her have her son. Stefan Arkadyevitch saw now that it was no good to dream of that, but still he was glad to see his nephew. Alexey Alexandrovitch reminded his brother-in-law that they never spoke to the boy of his mother, and he begged him not to mention a single word about her. "He was very ill after that interview with his mother, which we had not foreseen," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Indeed, we feared for his life. But with rational treatment and sea bathing in the summer, he regained his strength, and now, by the doctor's advice, I have let him go to school. And certainly the companionship of school has had a good effect on him, and he is perfectly well and making good progress. What a fine fellow he's grown! He's not Seryozha now, but quite full-fledged Sergei Alexeyitch," said Stefan Arkadyevitch, smiling as he looked at the handsome, broad-shouldered lad in blue coat and long trousers, who walked in alertly and confidently. The boy looked healthy and good-humoured. He bowed to his uncle as to a stranger, but recognizing him, he blushed and turned hurriedly away from him, as though offended and irritated at something. The boy went up to his father and handed him a note of the marks he had gained in school. "Well, that's very fair," said his father. "You can go." "He's thinner and taller, and has grown out of being a child into a boy. I like that," said Stefan Arkadyevitch. "Do you remember me?" The boy looked back quickly at his uncle. "Yes, mon oncle," he answered, glancing back at his father, and again he looked downcast. His uncle called him to him and took his hand. "Well, and how are you getting on?" he said, wanting to talk to him and not knowing what to say. The boy, blushing and making no answer, cautiously drew his hand away. As soon as Stefan Arkadyevitch let go his hand, he glanced doubtfully at his father, and like a bird set free, he darted out of the room. A year had passed since the last time Seryozha had seen his mother. Since then he had heard nothing more of her. In the course of that year he had gone to school and made friends among his schoolfellows. The dreams and memories of his mother, which had made him ill after seeing her, did not occupy his thoughts now. When they came back to him, he studiously drove them away, regarding them as shameful and girlish, below the dignity of a boy and a schoolboy. He knew that his father and mother were separated by some quarrel. He knew that he had to remain with his father, and he tried to get used to that idea. He disliked seeing his uncle, so like his mother, for it called up those memories of which he was ashamed. He disliked it all the more as from some words he had caught as he waited at the study door, and still more from the faces of his father and uncle, he guessed that they must have been talking of his mother. And to avoid condemning the father with whom he lived and on whom he was dependent, and above all to avoid giving way to sentimentality, which he considered so degrading, Seryozha tried not to look at his uncle, who had come to disturb his peace of mind, and not to think of what he recalled to him. But when Stefan Arkadyevitch, going out after him, saw him on the stairs, and calling to him asked him how he spent his playtime at school, Seryozha talked more freely to him away from his father's presence. "We have a railway now," he said in answer to his uncle's question. "It's like this, do you see? 2 sit on a bench, they're the passengers, and 1 stands up straight on the bench, and all are harnessed to it by their arms or by their belts, and they run through all the rooms. The doors are left open beforehand. Well, and it's pretty hard work being the conductor." "That's the one that stands?" Stefan Arkadyevitch inquired, smiling. "Yes. You want pluck for it, and cleverness too, especially when they stop all of a sudden or someone falls down." "Yes, that must be a serious matter," said Stefan Arkadyevitch, watching with mournful interest the eager eyes, like his mother's, not childish now, no longer fully innocent. And though he had promised Alexey Alexandrovitch not to speak of Anna, he could not restrain himself. "Do you remember your mother?" he asked suddenly. "No, I don't," Seryozha said quickly. He blushed crimson, and his face clouded over, and his uncle could get nothing more out of him. His tutor found his pupil on the staircase half an hour later, and for a long while he could not make out whether he was ill-tempered or crying. "What is it? I expect you hurt yourself when you fell down," said the tutor. "I told you it was a dangerous game, and we shall have to speak to the director. If I had hurt myself, nobody should have found it out, that's certain." "Well, what is it then?" "Leave me alone. If I remember, or if I don't remember, what business is it of his? Why should I remember? Leave me in peace," he said, addressing not his tutor but the whole world. Chapter 20. Stefan Arkadyevitch, as usual, did not waste his time in Petersburg. In Petersburg, besides business, his sister's divorce, and his coveted appointment, he wanted, as he always did, to freshen himself up, as he said, after the mustiness of Moscow. In spite of its cafés chantants and its omnibuses, Moscow was yet a stagnant bog. Stefan Arkadyevitch always felt it. After living for some time in Moscow, especially in close relations with his family, he was conscious of a depression of spirits. After being a long time in Moscow without a change, he reached a point when he positively began to be worrying himself over his wife's ill humor and reproaches, over his children's health and education, and the petty details of his official work. Even the fact of being in debt worried him. But he had only to go and stay a little while in Petersburg, in the circle there in which he moved, where people lived, really lived, instead of vegetating as in Moscow, and all such ideas vanished and melted away at once, like wax before the fire. His wife? Only that day he had been talking to Prince Tchetchensky. Prince Tchetchensky had a wife and family, grown-up pages in the corps, and he had another illegitimate family of children also. Though the first family was very nice too, Prince Tchetchensky felt happier in his second family, and he used to take his eldest son with him to his second family, and told Stefan Arkadyevitch that he thought it good for his son, enlarging his ideas. What would have been said to that in Moscow? His children? In Petersburg, children did not prevent their parents from enjoying life. The children were brought up in schools, and there was no trace of the wild idea that prevailed in Moscow, in Lvov's household, for instance, that all the luxuries of life were for the children, while the parents have nothing but work and anxiety. Here, people understood that a man is in duty bound to live for himself as every man of culture should live. His official duties. Official work here was not the stiff, hopeless drudgery that it was in Moscow. Here there was some interest in official life. A chance meeting, a service rendered, a happy phrase, a knack of facetious mimicry, and a man's career might be made in a trice. So it had been with Briantsev, whom Stefan Arkadyevitch had met the previous day, and who was one of the highest functionaries in government now. There was some interest in official work like that. The Petersburg attitude on pecuniary matters had an especially soothing effect on Stefan Arkadyevitch. Bartynyansky, who must spend at least 50,000 to judge by the style he lived in, had made an interesting comment the day before on that subject. As they were talking before dinner, Stefan Arkadyevitch said to Bartynyansky, "You're friendly, I fancy, with Mordvinsky. You might do me a favor. Say a word to him, please, for me. There's an appointment I should like to get. Secretary of the agency." "Oh, I shan't remember all that if you tell it to me. But what possesses you to have to do with railways and Jews? Take it as you will, it's a low business." Stefan Arkadyevitch did not say to Bartynyansky that it was a growing thing. Bartynyansky would not have understood that. "I want the money. I've nothing to live on." You're living, aren't you? Yes, but in debt. Are you, though? Heavily, said Bartynyansky sympathetically. Very heavily. 20,000. Bartynyansky broke into good-humoured laughter. "Ha, lucky fellow," said he. "My debts mount up to 1.5 million, and I have nothing. But still I can live, as you see." And Stepan Arkadyevitch saw the correctness of this view, not in words only, but in actual fact. Zhivagoff owed 300,000 and hadn't a farthing to bless himself with, and he lived, and in style too. Count Krivtsov was considered a hopeless case by everyone, and yet he kept 2 mistresses. Petrovsky had run through 5 millions and still lived in just the same style, and was even a manager in the financial department with a salary of 20,000. And besides this, Petersburg had physically an agreeable effect on Stepan Arkadyevitch. It made him younger. In Moscow he sometimes found a grey hair in his head, dropped asleep after dinner, stretched, walked slowly upstairs, breathing heavily, was bored by the society of young women, and did not dance at balls. In Petersburg he always felt 10 years younger. His experience in Petersburg was exactly what had been described to him on the previous day by Prince Pyotr Oblonsky, a man of 60 who had just come back from abroad. "We don't know the way to live here," said Pyotr Oblonsky. "I spent the summer in Baden, and you wouldn't believe it, I felt quite a young man. At a glimpse of a pretty woman, my thoughts... One dines and drinks a glass of wine and feels strong and ready for anything. I came home to Russia, had to see my wife, and what's more, go to my country place. And there, you'd hardly believe it, in a fortnight I'd got into a dressing gown and had given up dressing for dinner. Needn't say I had no thoughts left for pretty women. I became quite an old gentleman. There was nothing left for me but to think of my eternal salvation. I went off to Paris. I was as right as could be at once." Stepan Arkadyevitch felt exactly the difference that Pyotr Oblonsky described. In Moscow he degenerated so much that if he had had to be there for long together, he might in good earnest have come to considering his salvation. In Petersburg he felt himself a man of the world again. Between Princess Betsy Tverskaya and Stepan Arkadyevitch there had long existed rather curious relations. Stepan Arkadyevitch always flirted with her in jest, and used to say to her, also in jest, the most unseemly things, knowing that nothing delighted her so much. The day after his conversation with Karenin, Stepan Arkadyevitch went to see her, and felt so youthful that in this jesting flirtation and nonsense he recklessly went so far that he did not know how to extricate himself, as unluckily he was so far from being attracted by her that he thought her positively disagreeable. What made it hard to change the conversation was the fact that he was very attractive to her, so that he was considerably relieved at the arrival of Princess Myakaya, which cut short their tête-à-tête. "Ah, so you're here," she said when she saw him. "Well, and what news of your poor sister? You needn't look at me like that," she added. "Ever since they've all turned against her, all those who are 1,000 times worse than she, I've thought she did a very fine thing. I can't forgive Vronsky for not letting me know when she was in Petersburg. I'd have gone to see her and gone about with her everywhere. Please give her my love. Come, tell me about her." "Yes, her position is very difficult. She—" began Stepan Arkadyevitch, in the simplicity of his heart, accepting as sterling coin Princess Myakaya's words, "Tell me about her." Princess Myakaya interrupted him immediately, as she always did, and began talking herself. "She's done what they all do, except me, only they hide it. But she wouldn't be deceitful, and she did a fine thing. And she did better still in throwing up that crazy brother-in-law of yours. You must excuse me. Everybody used to say he was so clever, so very clever. I was the only one that said he was a fool. Now that he's so thick with Lydia Ivanovna and Landau,
They all say he's crazy, and I should prefer not to agree with everybody, but this time I can't help it." "Oh, do please explain," said Stepan Arkadyevitch. "What does it mean? Yesterday I was seeing him on my sister's behalf, and I asked him to give me a final answer. He gave me no answer and said he would think it over. But this morning, instead of an answer, I received an invitation from Countess Lydia Ivanovna for this evening." "Ah, so that's it, said Princess Myakaya gleefully. "They're going to ask Landau what he's to say." "Ask Landau? What for? Who or what's Landau?" "What? You don't know Jules Landau? Le fameux Jules Landau, le clairvoyant? He's crazy too, but on him your sister's fate depends. See what comes of living in the provinces? You know nothing about anything. Landau, you see, was a commis in a shop in Paris, and he went to a doctor's. And in the doctor's waiting room he fell asleep, and in his sleep he began giving advice to all the patients. And wonderful advice it was. Then the wife of Yuri Melodinsky, you know, the invalid, heard of this Landau and had him see her husband. And he cured her husband, though I can't say that I see he did him much good, for he's just as feeble a creature as ever he was. But they believed him and took him along with them and brought him to Russia. Here there's been a general rush to him, and he's begun doctoring everyone. He cured Countess Bezubova, and she took such a fancy to him that she adopted him." "Adopted him?" "Yes, as her son. He's not Landau any more, but Count Bezubov. That's neither here nor there, though. But Lydia, I'm very fond of her, but she has a screw loose somewhere, has lost her heart to this Landau now, and nothing is settled now in her house or Alexei Alexandrovitch's without him. And so your sister's fate is now in the hands of Landau, alias Count Bezubov." Chapter 21. After a capital dinner and a great deal of cognac drunk at Bartinyansky's, Stepan Arkadyevitch, only a little later than the appointed time, went in to Countess Lydia Ivanovna's. "Who else is with the Countess? A Frenchman?" Stepan Arkadyevitch asked the hall porter as he glanced at the familiar overcoat of Alexei Alexandrovitch and a queer, rather artless-looking overcoat with clasps. "Alexei Alexandrovitch Karenin and Count Bezubov," the porter answered severely. "Princess Myakaya guessed right," thought Stepan Arkadyevitch as he went upstairs. "Curious. It would be quite as well, though, to get on friendly terms with her. She has an immense influence. If she would say a word to Pomorsky, the thing would be a certainty." It was still quite light out of doors, but in Countess Lydia Ivanovna's little drawing-room the blinds were drawn and the lamps lighted. At a round table under a lamp sat the Countess and Alexei Alexandrovitch talking softly. A short, thinnish man, very pale and handsome, with feminine hips and knock-kneed legs, with fine, brilliant eyes and long hair lying on the collar of his coat, was standing at the end of the room, gazing at the portraits on the wall. After greeting the lady of the house and Alexei Alexandrovitch, Stepan Arkadyevitch could not resist glancing once more at the unknown man. "Monsieur Landau," the Countess addressed him with a softness and caution that impressed Oblonsky, and she introduced them. Landau looked round hurriedly, came up, and smiling laid his moist, lifeless hand in Stepan Arkadyevitch's outstretched hand, and immediately walked away and fell to gazing at the portraits again. The Countess and Alexei Alexandrovitch looked at each other significantly. "I am very glad to see you, particularly today," said Countess Lydia Ivanovna, pointing Stepan Arkadyevitch to a seat beside Karenin. "I introduced you to him as Landau," she said in a soft voice, glancing at the Frenchman, and again immediately after at Alexei Alexandrovitch. "But he is really Count Bezubov, as you are probably aware, only he does not like the title. Yes, I heard so, answered Stefan Arkadyevitch. They say he completely cured Countess Bezubova. She was here today, poor thing, the Countess said, turning to Alexey Alexandrovitch. This separation is awful for her. It's such a blow to her. And he positively is going? Queried Alexey Alexandrovitch. Yes, he is going to Paris. He heard a voice yesterday, said Countess Lydia Ivanovna, looking at Stefan Arkadyevitch. Ah, a voice, repeated Oblonsky, feeling that he must be as circumspect as he possibly could in this society, where something peculiar was going on, or was to go on, to which he had not the key. A moment's silence followed, after which Countess Lydia Ivanovna, as though approaching the main topic of conversation, said with a fine smile to Oblonsky, "I've known you for a long while, and I'm very glad to make a closer acquaintance with you. Les amis de nos amis sont nos amis. But to be a true friend, one must enter into the spiritual state of one's friend, and I fear that you are not doing so in the case of Alexey Alexandrovitch. You understand what I mean?" she said, lifting her fine, pensive eyes. "In part, Countess. I understand the position of Alexey Alexandrovitch," said Oblonsky. Having no idea of what they were talking about, he wanted to confine himself to generalities. "The change is not in his external position," Countess Lydia Ivanovna said sternly, following with eyes of love the figure of Alexey Alexandrovitch as he got up and crossed over to Landau. "His heart is changed, and new heart has been vouchsafed him, and I fear you don't fully apprehend the change that has taken place in him." "Oh, well, in general outlines I can conceive the change. We have always been friendly, and now," said Stefan Arkadyevitch, responding with a sympathetic glance to the expression of the Countess, and mentally balancing the question with which of the two ministers she was most intimate, so as to know about which to ask her to speak for him. "The change that has taken place in him cannot lessen his love for his neighbors. On the contrary, that change can only intensify love in his heart. But I am afraid you do not understand me. Won't you have some tea?" she said, with her eyes indicating the footman who was handing round tea on a tray. "Not quite, Countess. Of course, his misfortune. Yes, a misfortune which has proved the highest happiness, when his heart was made new, was filled full of it," she said, gazing with eyes full of love at Stefan Arkadyevitch. "I do believe I might ask her to speak to both of them," thought Stefan Arkadyevitch. "Oh, of course, Countess," he said. "But I imagine such changes are a matter so private that no one, even the most intimate friend, would care to speak of them." "On the contrary, we ought to speak freely and help one another." "Yes, undoubtedly so. But there is such a difference of convictions, and besides," said Oblonsky with a soft smile, "there can be no difference where it is a question of holy truth." "Oh, no, of course, but—" and Stefan Arkadyevitch paused in confusion. He understood at last that they were talking of religion. "I fancy he will fall asleep immediately," said Alexey Alexandrovitch in a whisper full of meaning, going up to Lydia Ivanovna. Stefan Arkadyevitch looked round. Landau was sitting at the window, leaning on his elbow and the back of his chair, his head drooping. Noticing that all eyes were turned on him, he raised his head and smiled a smile of childlike artlessness. "Don't take any notice," said Lydia Ivanovna, as she lightly moved a chair up for Alexey Alexandrovitch. "I have observed," she was beginning, when a footman came into the room with a letter. Lydia Ivanovna rapidly ran her eyes over the note, and excusing herself, wrote an answer with extraordinary rapidity, handed it to the man, and came back to the table. "I have observed," she went on, "that Moscow people, especially the men, are more indifferent to religion than anyone." Oh, no, Countess, I thought Moscow people had the reputation of being the firmest in the faith, answered Stefan Arkadyevitch. But as far as I can make out, you are unfortunately one of the indifferent ones, said Alexey Alexandrovitch, turning to him with a weary smile. How anyone can be indifferent, said Lydia Ivanovna. I am not so much indifferent on that subject as I am waiting in suspense, said Stefan Arkadyevitch, with his most deprecating smile. I hardly think that the time for such questions has come yet for me. Alexey Alexandrovitch and Lydia Ivanovna looked at each other. We can never tell whether the time has come for us or not, said Alexey Alexandrovitch severely. We ought not to think whether we are ready or not ready. God's grace is not guided by human considerations. Sometimes it comes not to those that strive for it, and comes to those that are unprepared, like Saul. No, I believe it won't be just yet, said Lydia Ivanovna, who had been meanwhile watching the movements of the Frenchmen. Landau got up and came to them. Do you allow me to listen? He asked. Oh, yes. I did not want to disturb you, said Lydia Ivanovna, gazing tenderly at him. Sit here with us. One has only not to close one's eyes to shut out the light, Alexey Alexandrovitch went on. Ah, if you knew the happiness we know, feeling his presence ever in our hearts, said Countess Lydia Ivanovna with a rapturous smile. But a man may feel himself unworthy sometimes to rise to that height, said Stefan Arkadyevitch, conscious of hypocrisy in admitting this religious height, but at the same time unable to bring himself to acknowledge his free-thinking views before a person who, by a single word to Pomorsky, might procure him the coveted appointment. That is, you mean that sin keeps him back, said Lydia Ivanovna. But that is a false idea. There is no sin for believers. Their sin has been atoned for. Pardon, she added, looking at the footman, who came in again with another letter. She read it and gave a verbal answer. Tomorrow at the Grand Duchess's, say. For the believer, sin is not, she went on. Yes, but faith without works is dead, said Stefan Arkadyevitch, recalling the phrase from the catechism and only by his smile clinging to his independence. There you have it, from the Epistle of St. James, said Alexey Alexandrovitch, addressing Lydia Ivanovna with a certain reproachfulness in his tone. It was unmistakably a subject they had discussed more than once before. What harm has been done by the false interpretation of that passage? Nothing holds men back from belief like that misinterpretation. I have not works, so I cannot believe, though all the while that is not said, but the very opposite is said. Striving for God, saving the soul by fasting, said Countess Lydia Ivanovna with disgusted contempt. Those are the crude ideas of our monks. Yet that is nowhere said. It is far simpler and easier, she added, looking at Oblonsky with the same encouraging smile with which at court she encouraged youthful maids of honor disconcerted by the new surroundings of the court. We are saved by Christ, who suffered for us. We are saved by faith, Alexey Alexandrovitch chimed in, with a glance of approval at her words. Vous comprenez l'anglais? Asked Lydia Ivanovna, and receiving a reply in the affirmative, she got up and began looking through a shelf of books. I want to read him Safe and Happy, or Under the Wing, she said, looking inquiringly at Karenin. And finding the book, and sitting down again in her place, she opened it. It's very short. In it is described the way by which faith can be reached, and the happiness, above all earthly bliss, with which it fills the soul. The believer cannot be unhappy, because he is not alone. But you will see. She was just settling herself to read when the footman came in again. "Madame Barreau's dinner. Tell her tomorrow at 2 o'clock. "Yes," she said, putting her finger in the place in the book, and gazing before her with her fine, pensive eyes. "That is how true faith acts. You know Marie Sanina. You know about her trouble. She lost her only child. She was in despair. And what happened? She found this comforter, and she thanks God now for the death of her child. Such is the happiness faith brings." "Oh, yes, that is most," said Stepan Arkadyevitch, glad they were going to read, and let him have a chance to collect his faculties. "No, I see I'd better not ask her about anything today," he thought. "If only I can get out of this without putting my foot in it." "It will be dull for you," said Countess Lydia Ivanovna, addressing Landau. "You don't know English, but it's short." "Oh, I shall understand," said Landau, with the same smile, and he closed his eyes. Alexey Alexandrovitch and Lydia Ivanovna exchanged meaningful glances, and the reading began. Chapter 22. Stepan Arkadyevitch felt completely nonplussed by the strange talk which he was hearing for the first time. The complexity of Petersburg, as a rule, had a stimulating effect on him, rousing him out of his Moscow stagnation. But he liked these complications and understood them only in circles he knew and was at home in. In these unfamiliar surroundings he was puzzled and disconcerted and could not get his bearings. As he listened to Countess Lydia Ivanovna, aware of the beautiful, artless, or perhaps artful, he could not decide which, eyes of Landau fixed upon him, Stepan Arkadyevitch began to be conscious of a peculiar heaviness in his head. The most incongruous ideas were in confusion in his head. Marie Sanina is glad her child's dead. How good a smoke would be now. To be saved, one need only believe, and the monks don't know how the thing's to be done, but Countess Lydia Ivanovna does know. And why is my head so heavy? Is it the cognac, or all this being so queer? Anyway, I fancy I've done nothing unsuitable so far. But anyway, it won't do to ask her now. They say they make one say one's prayers. I only hope they won't make me. That'll be too imbecile. And what stuff it is she's reading. But she has a good accent. Landau, Bezubov. What's he Bezubov for? And all at once Stepan Arkadyevitch became aware that his lower jaw was uncontrollably forming a yawn. He pulled his whiskers to cover the yawn and shook himself together. But soon after he became aware that he was dropping asleep and on the very point of snoring. He recovered himself at the very moment when the voice of Countess Lydia Ivanovna was saying, "He's asleep.